6 individuals, a single photograph. A riddle that has puzzled scholars for more than 100 years. Atlanta, Georgia, 1897. Inside a well-known photography studio on a crisp October afternoon, an affluent black family arranges itself before the lens. The father, clad in an impeccably fitted suit, exudes quiet command. The mother, elegant in a high-necked Victorian dress with fashionable sleeves, sits with composure and grace. Their 3 older children position themselves around their parents, their expressions solemn as the era demanded. And there, perched on the mother's lap, is a child who appears out of place. A small girl, perhaps 6 or 7, whose skin seems shockingly pale against her mother's darker hands, whose hair gleams an inexplicable light blonde beneath its carefully tied ribbon, whose very presence in this frame poses a question that no one, not the archivists who logged it, not the historians who examined it, not the genealogists who referenced it, has ever been able to answer. Who is this child, and why is she here? For 128 years, this photograph has remained silent, clutching its secret tightly. It has been archived, stored, scanned, and exhibited. Countless eyes have studied it, but no one grasped what they were truly seeing. No one realized that this single image contained evidence of something remarkable. A medical condition misunderstood in its era, a family's fierce and perilous love, and a life that should never have been possible within the harsh realities of Jim Crow America. Until now, if you wish to uncover the astonishing truth behind this enigmatic photograph and learn how one researcher finally cracked a 128-year-old puzzle that will reshape everything you thought you knew about the past, subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. What you are about to discover will leave you utterly speechless. Dr. Rebecca Torres was 6 months into digitizing 19th century Southern photography when she opened catalog file 308047. It was late February 2025. Nearly midnight in her Duke University office, and she was working through the final boxes from a recently acquired Atlanta collection. At first glance, the photograph seemed ordinary. A prosperous black family, a formal studio setting, the Victorian era. She began completing the standard documentation forms: estimated date, photographic process, probable location. Then she adjusted the screen brightness to inspect the details more closely. Her fingers halted over the keyboard. She stared at the monitor for several long seconds, then leaned nearer, narrowing her eyes. She zoomed in to 200%, then 400%. "That can't be right," she whispered. The family in the image was unmistakably African American. The parents, the 3 older children, all clearly black. Their attire was costly and well-tailored. Their posture radiated dignity and affluence. The studio backdrop and lighting indicated this was a significant, carefully orchestrated portrait. But the youngest child, a small girl seated centrally on her mother's lap, appeared to be white. Not light, skinned black, not biracial, white. Even in the sepia tones of 1890s photography, the disparity was undeniable. The child's skin was dramatically, jarringly lighter than everyone else in the frame. Her hair, styled with a dark ribbon, seemed blonde, almost platinum. Her small, pale hands rested against her mother's dark sleeve, like snow against midnight. Rebecca had studied historical photography for 15 years. She understood the technical constraints of 19th century cameras, the ways aging and chemical processes could distort images, the common patterns of degradation in old photographs. This was none of those things. The image quality was superb. There was no sign of retouching, composite work, or multiple exposures. The lighting was uniform across all subjects. This was a genuine, unaltered photograph of 6 people posed together, 5 black, 1 seemingly white. Rebecca's mind raced through possibilities. Adoption, but interracial adoption by a black family in 1897 Georgia would have been nearly impossible and certainly perilous. a neighbor's child included for some reason. But why would a costly formal portrait featured someone else's child positioned so intimately in the mother's arms? A photographic error. Two separate sittings somehow merged. No, the positioning, lighting, and focus were too flawless. She saved the file and flagged it for priority research. Whatever this photograph was, it was far from routine. It was a puzzle that had apparently baffled everyone who had seen it for over a century. And Rebecca Torres intended to solve it. The photograph carried almost no identifying details. The studio mark in the lower corner read, J. Morrison and Sons Photographers, Atlanta, a well-known establishment that operated between 1885 and 1903. The clothing styles and photographic paper suggested a date between 1895 and 1899. But there were no names, no written notes. Nothing to indicate who these people were. Rebecca contacted the estate executor, who had donated the collection. The photographs had belonged to Ernest Whitfield, a retired pharmacist who had spent 4 decades amassing African-American historical materials before his death at age 93. Uncle Ernest never properly cataloged most of it. His niece explained during their phone conversation. He just collected whatever he could find. He always said too much Black history was being destroyed or thrown away, so he saved everything he could get his hands on. Rebecca asked whether any documents, correspondence, or records might identify the families in the photographs. The niece promised to search through the remaining boxes before the estate auction. 3 weeks later, a package arrived at Duke. Inside were a handwritten receipt, a studio appointment book, and a fragile envelope of customer correspondence. The receipt, dated October 12, 1897, listed Washington family, 6 persons, formal sitting. 4 prints ordered, to $8.50 paid in full. Washington, a surname but no first names. The appointment book was more revealing. On October 12, 1897, at 2 p.m., Washington, proprietor, Auburn Avenue Tailoring Establishment, Family Portrait Commission. Rebecca's pulse quickened. Auburn Avenue, Atlanta. That was the heart of Black economic success. The street where Black-owned businesses flourished despite the escalating brutality of Jim Crow laws. If the Washingtons owned a tailoring business on Auburn Avenue, there would be city records. She spent the next week immersed in Atlanta archives, business directories, tax records, property deeds, commercial licenses. Finally, she found it. Thomas Washington, proprietor. Washington and Sons Fine Tailoring, 127 Auburn Avenue, established 1889. Cross-referencing with census records, she assembled the family structure. Thomas Washington, born 1855, wife Ruth, born 1858. 4 children listed in the 1900 federal census: David, age 16, Samuel, age 13, Grace, age 11, Clara, age 9. Clara, born approximately 1891, which would make her about 6 or 7 in an 1897 photograph. The youngest child. The position matched, but it still didn't explain the central mystery. Why did Clara Washington, daughter of 2 Black parents and sister to 3 Black siblings, appear white in this photograph? Rebecca knew she needed to uncover who Clara was and, more importantly, what had happened to her. She began constructing Clara Washington's life story from fragmentary records, searching for any clue that might explain the photograph's enigma. Atlanta city directories showed the Washington family's stability and success. Thomas Washington's tailoring business appeared in every directory from 1889 through 1904, with advertisements describing fine custom garments for distinguished gentlemen, and later, ladies and children's specialty tailoring. Church records from Big Bethel AM Church, one of Atlanta's oldest and most prominent Black congregations, listed the entire Washington family as members. Clara's baptism record, dated April 1892, confirmed her birth: Clara Marie Washington, daughter of Thomas and Ruth Washington, born February 14, 1891. The 1900 census showed the family living in a purchased home on Bell Street, Just off Auburn Avenue, a substantial two-story residence valued at $2,800, an impressive sum for a black family in that era. But nowhere in these routine records was there any explanation for Clara's appearance. Rebecca expanded her search into medical and institutional records, looking for any mention of unusual children, genetic conditions, or families dealing with medical anomalies. What she found was disturbing. In the Georgia State Archives, she discovered reports from the state sanitarium and various county poorhouses from the 1890s. Several entries referenced abnormal Negro children who had been surrendered by families or removed by authorities, children with physical differences, disabilities, or appearances that deviated from expectations. One entry from 1896 made Rebecca's stomach turn. Female child, approximately 4 years, Negro parents, unusual pigmentation, surrendered to institution by family, county unknown. The language was clinical and cruel. These children were treated as curiosities, defects, shameful secrets to be hidden away. Yet Clara Washington hadn't been hidden. Rebecca found her name in the 1899 Sunday school enrollment at Big Bethel. Clara Washington, age 8, intermediate class. She was attending church openly, participating in children's programs. In 1902, Gate City colored school records listed Clara as a student, though with an unusual notation. Modified attendance schedule, supplementary home instruction approved by administration. The school had made accommodations for her, but she was enrolled. She was being educated. She was part of the community. Whatever Clara's condition was, her family wasn't concealing her. They were raising her openly in a society that typically punished difference with violence or institutionalization. But Rebecca still didn't know what that condition was. The photograph showed the visual evidence, but without medical expertise, she couldn't interpret what she was seeing. She needed a specialist, someone who could examine a 128-year-old photograph and diagnose a mystery that had remained unsolved for over a century. Rebecca contacted Dr. James Mitchell, a geneticist at Emory University whose research focused on hereditary conditions and their historical documentation. She sent him the digitally enhanced photograph without explanation, asking simply, "What do you see when you look at this child?" His response came within 2 hours. "Where did you find this? I need to know everything about this image." They met the following afternoon in his office. Dr. Mitchell had already printed the photograph in high resolution and pinned it beside modern clinical images on his bulletin board. "This isn't a white child," he said immediately, pointing to Clara's figure in the photograph. "This is a black child with complete oculocutaneous albinism." Rebecca felt her breath catch. "Albinism. Look at the characteristics." Dr. Mitchell explained, his finger tracing Clara's features. The dramatically reduced pigmentation. Not just lighter skin, but near total absence of melanin, the very light hair, probably white, blonde or platinum, and if we could see her eyes in color, they'd almost certainly be blue or gray with visible red reflex from light hitting the retina. He pulled up clinical photographs on his computer. Oculocutaneous albinism is a genetic condition affecting melanin production. It occurs in all populations, including people of African descent. In black individuals, the contrast is particularly dramatic, exactly what we're seeing in this 1897 photograph. Rebecca stared at the image with new understanding. So she wasn't a white child in a black family. She was their biological daughter with a genetic condition. Exactly. And that makes this photograph historically extraordinary. Dr. Mitchell's voice carried intensity. "Now, do you understand what it meant for a black family in 1897 Georgia to have a child with albinism and raise her openly?" He pulled up research files. People with albinism, especially black children with albinism in the Jim Crow South, faced horrific discrimination. They were called ghost children, cursed, unnatural. Many communities believed they were supernatural beings or evidence of sin. Families typically hid these children completely, or worse. Rebecca asked quietly. Abandonment, institutionalization. In some cases, infanticide. Dr. Mitchell's expression was grim. There are documented cases of black children with albinism being killed by their own communities out of superstition and fear. He turned back to the photograph. But here's Clara Washington, posed formally with her family in an expensive studio portrait, dressed beautifully, held lovingly by her mother, included as an equal with her siblings. Her family was protecting her. Rebecca said. Her family was saving her life, Dr. Mitchell corrected, and documenting it for history. With the medical mystery solved, Rebecca needed to understand the world Clara lived in, the specific dangers she faced beyond the general brutality of Jim Crow segregation. Dr. Mitchell explained the medical challenges first. Albinism causes severe photosensitivity. Clara's skin would have burned within minutes of direct sun exposure. In Georgia's climate, without modern sunscreen or UV protective clothing, she would have needed to stay indoors most of the time or cover completely when outside. He continued, her vision would have been significantly impaired: nystagmus, involuntary eye movement, severe nearsightedness, extreme light sensitivity. In bright conditions, she might have been functionally blind. There were no treatments available in the 1890s, no corrective lenses that could help, no low vision aids. But the social dangers were even more severe. Rebecca found newspaper archives from 1890s, Atlanta filled with pseudoscientific racism, eugenics propaganda, and articles treating any physical difference in black people as evidence of inferiority. The Atlanta Constitution regularly published pieces promoting white supremacy and describing black Americans in dehumanizing terms. In this environment, a black child who appeared white would have been dangerous on multiple levels. White supremacists might have seen Clara as evidence of racial contamination or degeneracy, potentially targeting her family with violence. Black communities, influenced by African spiritual beliefs carried through slavery, sometimes viewed albinism as supernatural or cursed, leading to ostracism or worse. Rebecca found a chilling article from the Savannah Tribune, a black newspaper dated 1893, Tragic Death of Unusual Child. The brief report described a 6-year-old with a white appearance, born to colored parents, who died under suspicious circumstances in rural Georgia. The article implied the death wasn't accidental, but didn't elaborate. This was the reality the Washingtons navigated. Yet they had not only kept Clara alive, they had brought her to a public photography studio, posed her prominently in their family portrait, and ordered multiple prints to display. Rebecca found the studio's advertising from 1897. Morrison & Sons was one of Atlanta's premier photography establishments, serving both white and black clients in separate sessions. A sitting cost $8.5, nearly a week's wages for most workers. The Washingtons had spent significant money to create a formal document declaring Clara's place in their family. In an era when most families with children like Clara hid them completely, this was an act of defiance. But how had they protected her? How had Clara survived childhood when so many others didn't? Rebecca needed to find evidence of the family's protective strategies. Rebecca began searching for clues about how the Washingtons kept Clara safe while raising her openly. She found evidence in unexpected places. A classified advertisement in the Atlanta Independent, a black-owned newspaper from March 1898. Washington & Sons Tailoring, now offering ladies and children's garments, specializing in lightweight fabrics with superior coverage and comfort for summer wear. Rebecca understood immediately. Thomas Washington had expanded his business to create protective clothing for Clara. long sleeves, high collars, tightly woven fabrics that would block ultraviolet light, and made it a general service so it wouldn't draw attention specifically to his daughter's needs. The 1900 census revealed another layer of protection. The Washington household included Ruth's unmarried younger sister, Anna, aged 34, listed as residing with family, occupation domestic duties, but cross-referencing with church records showed Anna taught Sunday school and coordinated children's programs. Anna wasn't just living with them. She was Clara's full-time caretaker and guardian. Property records from 1895 showed the Washingtons had carefully chosen their home, a two-story house on Bell Street, with covered front and rear porches, mature shade trees on the property, and northern exposure. They had selected a house where Clara could be outside safely, protected from direct sunlight by shade and covered spaces. The modified school arrangement Rebecca had found earlier now made more sense. Gate City Colored School's 1902 records showed Clara attending classes in early morning and late afternoon sessions only, with approved home instruction supplement. The school administrators had worked with the family to create a schedule that allowed Clara to attend when the sun was less intense, while providing additional education at home during peak daylight hours. Rebecca found one more crucial detail in Big Bethel AME church records, a notation from 1899 stating that special provisions made for Washington family seating, north side, shaded location. Accommodation approved by council. Even the church had adapted its space to protect Clara, giving the family a permanent seat where she could attend services without sun exposure through the windows. The pattern was unmistakable. The Washingtons had built an entire infrastructure around Clara's needs, using their business success and community standing not to hide their daughter, but to create a life where she could participate safely. And their community, their church, their school, their neighbors on Auburn Avenue had helped them do it. This wasn't just one family's love story. It was evidence of a broader network of Black Atlantans who chose protection and inclusion over the prejudice that dominated the society around them. Rebecca knew that finding Clara's own words would be nearly impossible. Most Black women from this era left few written records, and someone with Clara's medical challenges would be even less likely to appear in historical documents. But she searched anyway. She contacted the Atlanta University Center archives, explaining what she was looking for, anything related to Clara Washington, born 1891, who would have been a young woman in the 1910s. The archivist called back 4 days later, excitement clear in her voice. "I found something. Not much, but it's definitely her." Rebecca drove to Atlanta that afternoon. The archivist led her to a temperature-controlled reading room and carefully placed a worn ledger on the table. This is from the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA, which served Black women and girls in Atlanta from 1910 through the 1960s. They offered classes, cultural programs, and social activities. She opened the ledger to a marked page attendance records for a 1913 poetry reading series. Clara M. Washington, age 22. She participated in their programs. The archivist continued flipping through pages. "Look, 1914 Music Appreciation Course here. 1915, member of the Literary Discussion Group. She was active in their social and cultural activities." Rebecca felt tears forming. Clara had lived a social life as a young woman. She hadn't been isolated or hidden. Then the archivist pulled out a slim folder. "This is what I really wanted to show you." Inside was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten contribution to the YWCA's 1916 newsletter, titled On Being Seen, the author C.M. Washington. Rebecca read carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "There are days when the sun feels like an enemy, when the brightness of the world forces me to retreat inside, when I must experience life through windows instead of directly. But I have learned this truth. Being seen is not the same as being visible. My family sees me, not my difference, but my soul. My community sees me, not as strange, but as their daughter, their sister, their neighbor. I see myself not through others' fear or curiosity, but through the love that has surrounded me since my first breath. That love taught me I belong in this world, even when the world was not built for people like me. Rebecca sat motionless, reading Clara's words again and again, understanding that she had found something precious. Direct testimony from a woman who shouldn't have survived, speaking across 109 years. Armed with Clara's own voice from 1916, Rebecca intensified her search for records of Clara's adult life. If she had been active in the YWCA and writing for their newsletter in her mid-20s, there had to be more. She found it in the Atlanta City Directory, 1919 Washington, Clara M., music instructor, residence 127 Auburn Avenue, music instructor. Clara had become a teacher. Rebecca requested employment records from the Atlanta Public Schools archives. What arrived astonished her. Clara Marie Washington had been employed from 1917 to 1949, 32 continuous years, as a music teacher in schools serving black children throughout Atlanta. The records showed she taught piano, music theory, vocal training, and directed student choirs. Rebecca understood the brilliance of this choice. Music instruction happened indoors, often in interior rooms or basements where light was minimal. Piano teaching was conducted one-on-one or in small groups, not requiring a teacher to see clearly across large spaces. Clara had found a profession perfectly suited to her medical limitations, while allowing her to contribute meaningfully to her community. Then Rebecca discovered a photograph in a 1924 issue of the Atlanta Daily World, the city's black newspaper. The image showed the faculty of Gate City Colored School, the same institution Clara had attended as a child with special accommodations. There in the second row stood a woman wearing a wide, brimmed hat and long sleeves, despite the apparent summer heat. Clara Washington, aged 33, now teaching at the very school that had welcomed her as a student. More evidence emerged. A 1932 church program from Big Bethel AME listing Clara Washington as director of the children's choir. A 1938 photograph of a student piano recital showing Clara seated at the instrument, her face turned slightly away from the camera to avoid the bright flash. The 1940 census listed Clara living with her widowed mother, Ruth, now age 82. Clara's occupation teacher, public school system. Clara had never married or had children, likely a deliberate choice. Understanding the genetic nature of albinism and the challenges of her own experience. But she had built a life of purpose, service, and community contribution. She had done more than survive in a world that told her she shouldn't exist. She had thrived, touched hundreds of lives through her teaching, and carved out a space of dignity and respect in a society built to deny her both. The girl in the 1897 photograph had grown into a woman of quiet, powerful resilience. Rebecca found Clara's death certificate in the Georgia Vital Records archive. Clara Mary Washington died January 8, 1970, age 78, Atlanta, Georgia. Cause of death: metastatic melanoma. The cruel irony struck Rebecca immediately. Clara had lived decades longer than anyone might have expected, carefully protected from sun damage by her family's vigilance and her own precautions. But albinism's brutal reality was that even minimal UV exposure accumulated over a lifetime. Without melanin's natural protection, skin cancer was nearly inevitable. Clara had outlived both her parents, her brothers David and Samuel, and her sister Grace. She had witnessed the transformation of Auburn Avenue from the center of black prosperity to a street struggling with urban renewal. She had lived through Jim Crow's worst years and seen the civil rights movement begin to dismantle the system that had threatened her existence. The death certificate listed her residence as the house on Bell Street, the same property her parents had purchased in 1895. She had spent her entire 78 years in that house. Rebecca requested probate records. Clara's will, filed February 1970, was straightforward. She left her modest estate, the house, her savings from teaching, personal possessions, to Big Bethel AM Church, with specific instructions that a scholarship fund be created for students pursuing music education, with preference given to those facing unusual challenges in achieving their educational goals. The Clara Washington Music Scholarship had been awarded annually from 1971 through 1994, supporting 23 students before the fund was absorbed into a larger church scholarship program. But one item in the probate inventory made Rebecca's breath catch. One framed family photograph, professional studio portrait, circa 1890s. Clara had kept the 1897 photograph for her entire life. It had hung in her house for 73 years. A reminder of the family who had chosen to love her visibly, who had defied every social pressure to claim her as their own, who had built a world where she could belong. That photograph had eventually been sold at an estate auction after the church liquidated Clara's property. It had passed through dealers and collectors for 55 years, ending up in Ernest Whitfield's collection, then Duke's archives, and finally on Rebecca's computer screen in February 2025. The mystery that no one had been able to solve for 128 years finally had its answer. And now Rebecca knew it was time to tell the world what that answer meant. Rebecca spent 4 months preparing her findings for publication. She wrote a comprehensive paper documenting Clara's life, the medical reality of albinism in the Black community, and the social context of families with disabled children in Jim Crow Atlanta. The Journal of Medical Humanities accepted it for publication in June 2025. But she also knew this story deserved broader attention. She contacted the Atlanta Journal, Constitution, and the Washington Post, offering them the complete narrative. The Atlanta paper published first in August 2025, The Mystery of the 1897 Photograph, how researchers finally identified a Black child with albinism and her family's extraordinary love. The article featured the 1897 photograph prominently alongside the 1924 faculty picture and excerpts from Clara's 1916 essay. It detailed the Washington family's protective strategies, Clara's 32-year teaching career, and the medical significance of the discovery. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, the newspaper received calls from people who had been Clara's students. An 87-year-old woman named Dorothy called from Decatur. Miss Clara taught me piano from 1946 to 1948, Dorothy said, her voice shaking. She was the gentlest teacher I ever had. She always wore gloves and long sleeves, even in summer, and she kept the music room dark and cool. But she never complained. She just made beautiful music and taught us to do the same. Another former student, now 74, remembered, Miss Clara couldn't see the sheet music clearly, so she taught us to play by ear and by touch. She'd place her hands over ours on the keys and guide us through the melody. She said music wasn't about reading notes. It was about feeling them in your heart. Big Bethel Church held a memorial service in September 2025, honoring Clara's life and reinstating the Clara Washington Music Scholarship as a permanent endowment. Over 400 people attended, including dozens of her former students. Rebecca was invited to speak. She brought the 1897 photograph, enlarged and professionally framed. This image, she told the packed congregation, shows a family's revolutionary act of love. In 1897, posing Clara for this portrait was dangerous. It invited scrutiny, prejudice, potential violence. But Thomas and Ruth Washington did it anyway, because Clara was their daughter, and they wanted the world to know it. She paused, looking at the photograph now displayed at the front of the church. For 128 years, this mystery went unsolved. People saw this image and couldn't understand what they were looking at. But now, we know the truth. We were looking at courage. We were looking at a family that chose love over fear, that built a community of protection around their most vulnerable member, and that gave Clara Washington a life she never should have been able to live in Jim Crow, Georgia. The photograph now hangs permanently in Big Bethel's Heritage Hall, finally understood after more than a century of silence. 6 months later, Rebecca received an email that began, "I believe Clara Washington was my great-great-aunt." The sender was Diane, age 49, living in Portland, Oregon. She was descended from Clara's brother Samuel, whose children had moved to the Pacific Northwest during World War II. "I grew up hearing vague family stories about Aunt Clara, who taught piano," Diane wrote, "but no one explained why she never left Atlanta or why there were no photographs of her in our family albums. When I saw your article and the 1897 portrait, everything finally made sense." Diane flew to Atlanta in November 2025. Rebecca met her at the church and showed her everything she had discovered about Clara's life. They stood together before the framed 1897 photograph. Diane stared at Clara, the small girl in her mother's lap, the one who looked so different, the one whose family loved her enough to make her visible when the world demanded she be hidden. "My grandmother must have known about Clara," Diane said quietly, tears streaming down her face. "Samuel's daughter. She must have known her aunt had albinism. But she never told us. Maybe she was protecting Clara's memory. Maybe she didn't know how to explain. Or maybe," Rebecca suggested gently, "she was continuing what your family had always done, protecting Clara in the way she thought best." Diane nodded. "I wish I'd known her. I wish I'd known this story while I was growing up." Before leaving Atlanta, Diane requested copies of everything. The photographs, the teaching records, Clara's essay, the newspaper articles. She wanted to share Clara's story with her children and grandchildren. "They need to know," she said, "that we come from people who chose love when the world chose hate, who built a life for someone society said didn't deserve one, who were brave enough to say, 'This is our daughter, and she belongs.'" Rebecca's research paper was published in September 2025 and won the year's Medical Humanities Award. More importantly, it became required reading in genetic counseling programs, medical history courses, and disability studies departments across the country. Clara Washington's story, accidentally preserved in a photograph misunderstood for 128 years, finally solved by medical expertise and historical determination, now teaches thousands of students annually about genetics, family resilience, and the intersection of race, disability, and love in American history. The mystery that no one could unravel has finally been solved. And the little girl in her mother's lap, the one who seemed impossible, who defied explanation, whose very existence was a puzzle, has finally received the recognition and honor she always deserved. The 1897 photograph no longer holds a mystery. It holds a testament. Her file content end.